The 1980s weren't just about neon, big hair, and epic music. Beneath all the glitz and pop culture, it was a decade shadowed by chilling, real-life tragedies. While people were dancing to cassette tapes and watching MTV, the world was also witnessing some truly horrifying deaths that seemed almost surreal. From shocking murders that gripped entire cities to bizarre accidents that defied explanation, these events left a lasting and unsettling mark on history. Headlines screamed of incidents so grim and macabre that they felt like something out of a dark movie rather than real life. Families were torn apart, communities were left in shock, and the public couldn't look away, captivated by the grim reality behind the sensational stories. These deaths weren't just tragedies, they became part of the eerie cultural memory of the decade, a reminder that behind the flashy exterior of the 80s, darkness lurked. The story of Ken Rex McElroy is one of those rare, real-life episodes that feels too unbelievable for fiction. A long, tense build-up that ended in one of the most chilling examples of community justice in American history. And whether people view it as justice, desperation, or vigilantism often depends on how much of his decades-long reign of terror they have read about. For years, McElroy operated in and around the small farming town of Skidmore, Missouri, treating the community like an arena where he made the rules, and everyone else simply tried not to get caught in his crosshairs. He was known for thefts, assaults, arson, intimidation, and an almost ritualistic habit of threatening anyone who dared press charges, stalking them, sitting outside their homes with rifles, and sending a clear message that crossing him came with consequences. Despite a record overflowing with accusations and investigations, he kept slipping through the legal system, often because witnesses were too terrified to testify, and at other times because he could afford lawyers who knew how to weaken rural prosecutions. The breaking point arrived after McElroy shot the local grocer, an elderly man he had already been harassing over a petty dispute involving his daughter. And even then, after the town watched the victim nearly die, McElroy was convicted only of assault and immediately granted bail, which he used not for reflection or remorse, but to continue haunting the victim's home with a loaded gun, as if daring the town to challenge him. By this period, Skidmore's fear had hardened into something heavier, an exhausted, simmering resentment that grew from years of watching a system fail them so completely that trust in the law had worn thin. On July 10, 1981, when McElroy arrived in town with his wife and settled into his pickup truck outside the local bar, dozens of residents gathered nearby, not necessarily as a planned group, but as people who had reached a collective emotional limit. What followed has been retold in documentaries, investigative reports, and countless true crime discussions, but the details remain strangely unified. Shots rang out, multiple rifles fired, and Ken McElroy collapsed over his steering wheel, killed instantly in broad daylight, while an entire crowd stood present and frozen by the weight of the moment. Even more remarkable and unsettling was what happened afterward. When investigators questioned the residents, every person insisted they had not seen anything, creating one of the most famous walls of silence ever recorded in an American homicide case. McElroy's wife named specific shooters, but no one else supported her, and the town's quiet unity erased any possibility of a successful prosecution. For many outsiders, the incident raises uncomfortable questions about justice, fear, responsibility, and what happens when a community feels abandoned by the institutions designed to protect them. For many locals, both then and now, it marked the end of a nightmare that the law had repeatedly failed to stop. Whether viewed as a desperate last resort or a troubling example of collective vigilantism, the killing of Ken McElroy remains one of the most haunting, unresolved cases in American history. Not because the identity of the shooter is unknown, but because everyone knows, and yet no one has ever spoken, and that silence has become part of the legacy that continues to define the story today. The Chicago Tylenol murders of 1982 were a shocking and unprecedented act of product tampering that left 7 people dead and caused widespread fear across the nation. Ordinary Americans, trusting the safety of over-the-counter medications, suddenly found themselves at risk from something as routine as a painkiller. Victims included children, young adults, and parents, highlighting the random and senseless nature of the attacks. Investigators quickly discovered that the Tylenol capsules had been laced with potassium cyanide, a highly lethal poison, and that the contamination had occurred after the products had left the factory and reached store shelves. This meant that the perpetrator had deliberately bypassed multiple safeguards to carry out the attacks, targeting unsuspecting consumers in a completely indiscriminate manner. The random nature of the poisonings created massive panic, with consumers avoiding pharmacies and questioning the safety of common household items. Local authorities and federal agencies, including the FBI, worked tirelessly to trace the source, but despite extensive efforts, the perpetrator was never identified, leaving the case unsolved and shrouded in mystery. The tragedy demonstrated how a single act of malicious intent could ripple through a community, undermining trust in everyday products and leaving lasting psychological impacts. Johnson & Johnson, the company behind Tylenol, responded promptly and decisively, recalling 31 million bottles of the product and halting production and distribution to prevent further casualties. Their transparent and proactive approach, which included cooperating fully with authorities and openly communicating with the public, has since been regarded as a textbook example of corporate crisis management. The company faced enormous pressure, both from the public and the media, yet its actions helped to limit further harm and restore consumer confidence over time. The murders also prompted sweeping changes in product safety regulations throughout the United States. Tamper-evident packaging, safety seals, and stricter quality control procedures were introduced across the pharmaceutical industry to prevent similar incidents in the future. These measures became standard practice, permanently transforming the way medicines and other consumer products were packaged and sold. Beyond immediate safety concerns, the Tylenol case emphasized the ethical responsibility of corporations to act swiftly and transparently in protecting public health, illustrating how corporate conduct could directly impact societal trust. The Chicago Tylenol murders continued to hold significance decades later, both as an unsolved criminal case and as a milestone in public health and corporate responsibility. The case has been extensively studied in law enforcement, public health, and business ethics courses as an example of how vigilance, communication, and rapid action are essential in managing crises. The victims, remembered for the tragic and senseless way their lives ended, also left a legacy of lasting change that improved protections for millions of consumers. The murders served as a turning point in understanding the vulnerabilities of everyday life, highlighting the need for safety measures and regulatory oversight. Even 40 years later, the case serves as a cautionary tale about the potential for harm from seemingly mundane sources and the critical role of ethical corporate behavior, government oversight, and consumer awareness. While the perpetrator remains unknown, the legacy of the Chicago Tylenol murders endures in safer packaging, enhanced corporate accountability, and the lessons learned about protecting public trust and public health in the modern era. Elisa Izquierdo's story is one of the most tragic examples of child abuse in modern American history, and it remains a haunting reminder of how vulnerable children can fall through the cracks of a system meant to protect them. Born in 1989 in Brooklyn, New York, Elisa should have been surrounded by love, care, and the innocence of childhood. Instead, she was trapped in a cycle of abuse from the very people who were supposed to protect and nurture her. Her mother, Awilda Lopez, had a documented history of neglect and violent behavior, and despite repeated warnings and reports, the child welfare system failed to intervene effectively. Over the years, Elisa endured horrific abuse, including severe physical beatings, burns, and malnutrition. Each injury, each cry for help, was a signal that went largely unnoticed or inadequately addressed by authorities, neighbors, and even school officials who encountered her bruised and battered body. The system that was supposed to shield her from harm repeatedly fell short, highlighting systemic flaws in child protection and social services. Elisa's grandmother initially tried to care for her, providing a brief period of stability and protection. However, custody battles with her mother complicated her life, and the courts ultimately returned Elisa to Awilda Lopez's care. This decision proved catastrophic. By the time Elisa was 6 years old, she had suffered an unimaginable number of injuries, some of which were so severe that medical professionals were alarmed. The neglect and violence escalated, but interventions remained insufficient or too slow to save her. On November 21, 1995, Elisa Izquierdo died in her mother's apartment as a result of the severe abuse she had endured over the years. The circumstances of her death shocked New York City and the entire nation, not only because of the brutality she faced, but also because her case revealed how deeply flawed the child welfare system was at the time. The death of Elisa Izquierdo prompted public outrage and became a catalyst for change. Lawmakers and social services agencies faced intense scrutiny, and reforms were implemented to prevent such a tragedy from happening again. Elisa's law was enacted in New York State, establishing stricter procedures for reporting and investigating child abuse, as well as improving coordination between social services, schools, and law enforcement. Her story has been cited in numerous studies and reports on child protection, serving as a grim example of what can happen when warning signs are ignored. It also brought attention to the broader issue of domestic violence and the need for vigilance by communities, families, and authorities alike. While the details of Elisa's suffering are heartbreaking, her story has also served as a call to action. It reminds society of the importance of safeguarding children and holding systems accountable when they fail. It underscores the need for compassion, vigilance, and timely intervention in cases of abuse. Though Elisa Izquierdo's life was tragically short, her legacy continues to influence child welfare policies and awareness campaigns, ensuring that her death was not in vain. Her story is a sobering lesson in the consequences of neglect and the critical importance of protecting the most vulnerable members of society. In remembering Elisa, we are compelled to acknowledge both the failings that led to her death and the responsibility of every adult to ensure that no child suffers as she did. In the mid-1980s, California was rocked by a series of crimes that would leave a lasting mark on the public consciousness. Richard Ramirez, later dubbed the Night Stalker, became synonymous with fear and unpredictability. Unlike many criminals, Ramirez did not target specific types of people or neighborhoods. His victims were chosen seemingly at random, making his reign of terror feel utterly inescapable. From Los Angeles to the Bay Area, ordinary citizens found themselves in the terrifying position of realizing that anyone could be next. Ramirez's attacks were brutal and shocking in their variety. He used knives, guns, hammers, and other weapons to murder, assault, and terrorize. Many victims were subjected to sexual assault, torture, or humiliation before being killed. In some cases, Ramirez left behind symbols associated with Satanism, and survivors reported that he forced them to swear allegiance to dark forces. The randomness and sheer brutality of his crimes made the public feel unsafe in their own homes, transforming ordinary private spaces into sites of fear. Ramirez's background offered some insight, though it did little to explain the intensity of his violence. Born in 1960 in El Paso, Texas, he was exposed to a chaotic and abusive environment from a young age. Influences such as family violence, exposure to criminal activity, and an early fascination with violent media may have contributed to his eventual descent into murder. By the time he moved to California, he had begun developing the habits and methods that would define his infamous crime spree. Ramirez became known for breaking into homes at night, often entering quietly through unlocked doors or windows, striking when his victims were most vulnerable. In addition to the immediate physical danger, he left behind psychological scars. Surviving family members often recounted feelings of helplessness, betrayal of trust, and a persistent fear of returning to normal life. The investigation into Ramirez's crimes was long and challenging, largely because his attacks were unpredictable and left few consistent clues. For months, law enforcement struggled to identify a pattern, while the public remained in a state of constant anxiety. Breakthroughs came through careful forensic work, including linking shoe prints to a rare type of sneaker and matching fingerprints recovered from a stolen vehicle. Ultimately, it was the involvement of ordinary citizens that led to his capture. Neighbors recognized him on the street, chased him down, and restrained him until authorities arrived. This moment underscored both the level of fear he had generated and the communal effort required to end his spree. Ramirez's trial in 1989 was closely followed by the media and the public. He faced multiple charges, including 13 counts of murder, numerous counts of attempted murder, sexual assault, and burglary. The evidence was overwhelming, and he was convicted on nearly all counts, receiving the death penalty. Even during the trial, Ramirez showed little remorse, which only reinforced the horror surrounding his actions. He spent the remainder of his life in prison, where he ultimately died of B-cell lymphoma in 2013. The case of Richard Ramirez remains a chilling example of the vulnerability of ordinary people in the face of random violence. It illustrates the terrifying impact of a criminal who does not discriminate in choosing victims, and it demonstrates the deep psychological and social effects of such crimes on communities. While sensationalized in media coverage, the legacy of the Night Stalker serves as a sobering reminder of the importance of law enforcement, forensic investigation, and community awareness in protecting public safety. Ramirez's story is not just one of shock and fear, but also a case study in how society responds to extreme criminal behavior and the ways in which vigilance and collective action can ultimately bring justice. Between 1979 and 1981, Atlanta, Georgia, was plunged into fear and uncertainty as more than 25 children and young adults disappeared under tragic and mysterious circumstances. Most of the victims were African American boys aged between 7 and 14, though some were older teens and young adults. The pattern of disappearances was random, yet chillingly consistent, leaving families, communities, and authorities deeply unsettled. Parents were terrified to let their children play outside or walk to school, and the city's sense of security was shattered. Schools, neighborhoods, and local organizations were consumed with worry as people struggled to understand how such violence could strike so indiscriminately in their midst. The investigation into the Atlanta child murders became one of the most extensive and scrutinized cases of the time. Police faced immense pressure from the public and media to identify the perpetrator and bring an end to the killings. Law enforcement poured resources into tracking leads, interviewing witnesses, and analyzing physical evidence, yet progress was slow. The mystery surrounding the disappearances only intensified the fear, as every new missing child raised questions about the safety of the entire community. In 1981, Wayne Williams, a 23-year-old local music promoter, was arrested and later convicted for the murders of 2 adult men whose cases were connected to the child murders through fiber evidence. While Williams was never tried for the murders of the children themselves, authorities attributed at least 20 of the killings to him, concluding that he was responsible for the majority of the tragedies that had gripped the city. Despite Williams' conviction, many questions remained, and controversy lingered over whether he acted alone or if other individuals were involved. Families of the victims struggled with grief and uncertainty, and public trust in the investigation was complicated by racial tensions and the challenges of law enforcement at the time. The Atlanta child murders highlighted systemic issues in policing, particularly regarding crimes affecting marginalized communities, and exposed the difficulties of solving serial crimes under intense public scrutiny. The case also prompted changes in investigative procedures, including the use of forensic evidence and the coordination of resources between local and federal authorities as a way to prevent similar tragedies in the future. The impact of the Atlanta child murders extended far beyond the immediate fear and grief experienced by families. Communities remained cautious long after the murders ceased, and the case left a lasting mark on the city's collective memory. Annual reflections, documentaries, and renewed investigations in later decades serve as reminders of the lives lost and the enduring need for vigilance and justice. The tragedy underscored the vulnerability of children and young adults to violence and the profound consequences when a city's safety is violated. While decades have passed since the last known murder, the Atlanta child murders remain a haunting chapter in American history, illustrating both the capacity for evil and the resilience of communities confronting unspeakable loss.